So we'll start right now, 8 minutes. The Forge is a poem by Seamus Heaney, and it is from his 1969 collection, Door into the Dark. The title of the poem describes a forge of the blacksmith, which was an integral part of the rural pastoral society that Heaney really liked to describe, and it revives the traditional elements of the day, which have now, to modern readers, may seem a little old school, a little old-fashioned and outdated, but the point of this is my thesis, that these elements of the poem that Heaney draws both from fantasy and from the traditionalist aspects of the world, they both illustrate the attitude of the writer towards his craft and how it requires an understanding of the world as well as an ability to transcend the typical matters which often define society. And this leads me to my first argument, which is the concept of the door, which is outlined in the first line of the poem. It illustrates this idea of being unsure of the future, but at the same time, this balance, maintaining the stasis of ideas. And this is really the reason why this is so important is because the door, the two sides of the door, on one, it's the cornerstone of the society. It's the defining aspect of a rural town. It's the forge. But on the outside is where everyone else is. It's the place where society is always transforming. There might be a day when the forge is not even relevant, which is what Heaney is mainly addressing to the readers who are a bit more omniscient. And the reason why, the careful use of syntax in the first sentence, which ends with the period. All I know is a door into the dark. The fact that the speaker, the persona, does not know what is inside or outside means he has the dilemma. All he knows is the door itself. That there are two pathways that he could take. But perhaps it's the middle ground which is the most important. And this is what relates to the title of the entire collection of poems. And this continues in the second and third lines, this idea of opposing ideas, this contrasting diction, the juxtaposition, which is a literary device of the outside and the inside, is also used to create the distance between the idea of the old and the new. And this continues even way farther down in the poem. On the 12th line, there's an anachronism of the traffic flashing in rows. This idea of the new, and it really enamors the thoughts of the outside world. And there are many more examples of how the speaker is very unsure of what's going on. The unpredictable fantail sparks. The forge itself is a place that is lively and where lots of actions are going on. However, this unpredictable fantail is also a message that there is no way to prognosticate what will happen further on. And this idea of how it really defines the speaker's personality, because they have these elements of awe at the forge itself. And this represents, as we tie back to the main idea of Heaney's view towards his own writing and being a poet, how there is an internal dilemma because you are independent and different from everyone else in the world, having to focus on the abstract. And it's really a sagacious idea. This having this resplendent anvil, the forge, as the key to as the place of worship. Almost, this is my second argument, that the anvil acts as this icon, and it also represents the aspirations of the author, the place of worship, the middle of the lines. And this is especially significant because the structure is specifically conforms to this, having the rhyme scheme ABBA-CDDC as part of a sonnet, the 14-line poem, focusing the first part on the idea of how important this is, almost a religious aspect, that the anvil is horned as a unicorn, the simile here, and having specific punctuation at this part preceding the altar really emphasizes how important the altar is and how it's the center, especially the fact that the octet ends right at that line where the altar goes. And then the next part, there's another 6-line stanza, which is how the structure of the sonnet works. This punctuation, dotted throughout the poem, is striated. It's very patterned, and it's really the commas always succeed specific literary devices. And as I was talking about the religious idea of how it could ultimately be a religious act of writing, and how there is an allusion to Vulcan, the Roman god of the forge, in the last 6 lines, because the blacksmith shares many similar characteristics to this god, having these elements of hairs in his nose, leather apron, grunting, going inside. That's an alliteration right there. And this vivid imagery, this allegory in general for Heaney's writing is filled chock full with so many different ideas, so many different devices. Onomatopoeia appears in the 5th line when he says hiss, and also the 13th line when the slam and a flick, because this emphasizes how the forge is an always active place, while perhaps the outside world is just not as interesting. But perhaps there's also a responsibility. This is my conclusion, that there's a responsibility for inside of the forge to work through it to convey this message to the outside. And this is especially seen in the lines when they're making a shoe with the anvil, how there's a double entendre in the word shoe toughening in water. Toughening, perhaps also being prepared to approach the outside world, to spread this message, to combat the supercilious elements which pervade modern society. 8 minutes are up, guys. So it's not very, you see, okay, if you guys listen to that 6-minute part of the poem, 6-minute mark, I began to really speed up my analysis, because I saw the 6 minutes or the 5 minutes, and I realized that I had so much on this page that I could not convey it all in that 8 minutes. There's so much to talk about in this poem. This poem is actually, when I first saw it, I struggled, but then I realized there's so many devices you can point out. The punctuation, the commas, not the commas, the colon in the middle is really significant. The structure, the sonnet, this is the easiest one to talk about in terms of structure, because it has the rhyme scheme, and it also has the idea of the sonnet, and it also switches up the rhyme scheme at the end compared to Petrarchan or Shakespearean sonnets. And although it's maybe hard to find the theme, you can always just focus on juxtaposition, onomatopoeia, alliteration, diction, metaphor, allusion, anachronism, so many different things to talk about. Syntax, allegory, analogy, symbolism, figurative language, imagery. I wrote all of these things down. I didn't have time to talk about it all. I should have used the word duality. That's a pretty interesting. That will certainly get you marks. Subjugation, preeminent. I wrote a lot about the boy's qualities, how he's sagacious, indignant, obsequious. He views the forge in almost a servile manner. And I did not talk about how the mood. I did not talk about the mood and the tone shift. That's a major thing. So if she asked me about, oh, next part, if she asked me for the next 2 minutes to talk about mood and tone shift, I could talk about how the forge is dark, but it's also a sacred place, and you feel this awe inside. It's almost like a church, and how the tone shift happens at the 8th line, and how that conforms to the structure, which I kind of said. Also, how the artist is personified in the second last line. Well, that's it, guys.